We're going live.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Glad to have you here this afternoon.
So good to be back in the fall for our summer series. That's kind of
So
funny.
it is funny. Feels like we just finished our show, didn't we?
Yeah, it does. It does. So, how you feeling today?
I'm doing good. How about you, Judy?
I'm terrific, and I'm still struggling to keep summer here as long as I can. So I think
Yeah.
a summer extension is a great idea.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Now that
yeah.
we're starting to feel the weather changes and everything, so
Hmm.
Oh
It's a
definitely.
yeah,
beautiful day here in Newport News today. Nice
it
and
is a beautiful day here in
sunshine.
central New Jersey as well.
And same as
Hmm.
Nashville, Tennessee.
All right, the whole East
So
All
Coast.
right.
we
Well,
are
at least the
covered.
weather is good if nothing else is quite right with the world right now. So yeah. But
20.
anyway, it's great to be here. I am Renata Yarbrough Sanders, coming to you from Newport News, Virginia, and very excited that we have decided to at least pop in. We can't make any promises that it's going to be every season, but at least we've popped in for this wonderful fall episode, and we're very excited to have our guest, Judy Russell, with us today, who will introduce herself in a few minutes. We are going to get right to the point in a few minutes here so that Judy can share with us about the law. And I'm just happy to be here. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Please share this, tell your friends, tell them come on in. Doesn't matter whether they have North Carolina research or not, they are going to learn something today.
Yes, and it's good to see people in the comments saying they're glad to be back as well. We have some of our regulars, some new people. So again, we are appreciative for everyone taking the time to come join us. So,
All right, Judy, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am Judy Russell. I live in New Jersey and do no research at all in New Jersey. On my mother's side, I'm literally the first generation ever to even live north of the Mason Dixon line, much less have ancestors from up here. So I'm entirely US Southern on my mother's side, and I'm a first generation American of German descent on my father's side. But on my mother's side, deep, deep roots in Western North Carolina. Practically every county from the old Rowan County, which was
mhm.
like from the center all the way over to the Tennessee line, that's my turf. That's my territory. So
Okay. All
Burke,
right.
Yancey, Mitchell, the county seat of Mitchell County, North Carolina is Bakersville, and that is named after my fourth great grandfather.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
wow.
Interesting.
I absolutely have got very deep North
Very deep roots.
All right. So you're a Carolina girl, is what you're trying to say.
And
Hmm.
in that one, those lines that went down there just after the revolution, yes, indeed.
Okay. All right. Well, we're so excited about today's episode. And I know that our guests are kind of used to Tania and I doing a little intro presentation, but we want to give all the time to Judy today. So I just want to say that we are just so excited about this because knowing the law of the area that you're researching and the time period that you're researching is essential to really being able to properly interpret the research that you're doing on your ancestors. And so I have had a number of situations where this is important to me. One, if any of you have ever seen my Finding Calvin talk, where I discuss following my enslaved great grandfather through his four different owners, it was essential for me to understand why it was that his female owner, when she married, that her property, including her enslaved property, automatically became the property of her husband. There were laws that mandated that I had to understand. There's another situation where one of my free ancestors of color in Tyrrell County was actually arrested for trading with an enslaved person. It was against the law to do so in North Carolina. So I had to understand that also. So those are just a couple of tidbits from my own research that have made me understand the importance of what Judy's going to be talking to us about today. And Tania, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I don't have as great examples, but I will say, even in past episodes, we've talked about how knowing the laws can help you even in finding records, right? And so one way that that's been particularly helpful for me are the marriage laws, because North Carolina had so many transitions in what they require by law for marriage documentation that knowing that has helped me, generally speaking, as I seek marriage records. So I'm going to be very much looking forward to hearing what Judy has to share so that even I can learn more and go that next level.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to any of you who are joining us who don't have North Carolina ancestry, even though Judy will be speaking specific to the laws of North Carolina because this show is about North Carolina, what she's going to be sharing with you can be applied in other states. It's just that you have to check those states for what their particular laws were. But no matter where you're researching, it's important to know the law. So without further ado, I'm going to give the show over to Judy Russell. She will give you some caveats as how we're going to do the Q&A today. So listen carefully. And also Judy has been generous enough to share a handout of resources. We will be putting those resources in the show notes, and we will also be putting them on our Google Drive, and Tania will put a link in the chat so that everybody has access to those resources or to the handout that Judy has shared with us. So Judy, it's all yours.
Terrific. We'll see what we can do about getting the screen sharing going. It's always a question of, all right, is this going to work this time, or is it not going to work this time? Mm-hmm. So in terms of the questions and the chat, the biggest thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to lose anybody. So a lot of what you may think of as a question, it may be something we're going to get to, but if I'm losing you, if it's, I got to have an answer to this right now, or we're just not going to feel good, please go ahead, put it in the chat, but put an asterisk or even a couple of asterisks in front of it to alert Renata and Tania that that's a question that they need to break in with. Otherwise, we're going to have time at the end. And I'm willing to spend some time and see if we can explore some of these issues. And before anybody asks, because it's always the first question is, what is that image? That's the first North Carolina State House. It was destroyed by fire in 1831, but there's this terrific painting of it in the North Carolina State Archives. So that's what you're looking at. And what we're going to be trying to do is to understand some of the North Carolina records, and in fact, the records of any jurisdiction, by understanding the laws of that jurisdiction. Because we all have these problems. We all start with a record, and we think we understand it. We come across a record like this one, which is the marriage bond of Christopher Amburn and Leanna Dean. It's from 1787. They married in Guilford County, North Carolina. But like so many other women of her era, Leanna found herself widowed in just a few short years. She ended up administering her husband's estate. Now, when we come across a document like this one, and now this is Burke County in Western North Carolina, it's a burned county, so there aren't any probate files. You have to go with the court minutes there. And you get a note that she was made the administratrix of his estate and posted a bond with security. Now, this document is telling us a story about the Amberns. It's telling us about the status of the Amburn family, how well they were doing compared to other people there in Western North Carolina. But how do we know? How do we know? Now, we can go on in the court records, and again, the court records are all we have. And we can see that she ended up having to sell his personal property and make a return to the court, explaining what it was that the personal property had earned in a sale. And it was 35 pounds, 16 shillings, 5 pence there in 1799. Now, this again tells us a story. This is essentially small potatoes, the equivalent of a few $100s today. It tells us something that there's not a word in the court minutes about setting Leanna's dower rights. That's part of the story. There's no land. There's no real property. There's nothing of value in this estate. And we know that by 1801, Leanna's position was really precarious. And we know that because in 1801, the court ordered her to bring her children to court in order that the court may dispose of them as the law directs. Now, we know they didn't take her children away from her in 1801. We know that because there's another record in 1807. And it clearly tells us that things had gone from bad to worse. And in January of 1807, the county court there in Burke County took Leanna's 2 youngest children away from her. And they bound them out to a local landowner to raise. The story of a woman disadvantaged by a legal system that didn't recognize her, the mother, as having any rights to these children at all. A legal system that was only concerned with, are these kids ever going to be public charges? Can we make sure that they get a skill that's going to make them valuable to the community? That's what was going on in this binding out, this involuntary apprenticeship of Leanna Amburn's children. And we can build on this record and these documents. And of course, it's going to give us the sense that we understand what's going on a half century later, further to the east in North Carolina, when a man by the name of Daniel Russell, no relation whatsoever, went into the Robeson County Court and had a whole bunch of orphaned freedmen children bound out to him as apprentices. So we get it, right? We know that this is another case where there was a concern that they would be public charges if he didn't take them in, right? Not so fast. This may be our best example of the fact that there's an essential rule that we need to follow as genealogists. We need to stop and think about every time we find one of these documents. Because if we're going to understand the records, you heard it before, you'll hear it a lot, we have to understand the law. And this isn't an abstract. This isn't a, we need to understand it generally. No, we need to understand the law at the moment that record was created and in the place where that record was created. Now, I don't mean to say that every single time we're going to have to be looking at statutes. Sometimes what our essential problem is we don't understand the language of the record that we're reviewing. And I'm reminded of the very first time I met a whole bunch of my Western North Carolina relatives, and a bunch of us were sitting there with our computers and our databases. And there was a cousin absolutely insisting that our shared fourth great grandfather, David Baker, was a lawyer there in Burke County. And he came to that conclusion because of this record, the 1820 census of Burke County, where David Baker was recorded as David Baker Esquire. So, well, lawyers today are Esquire, right? But that's not the way the word was used then. The reality, of course, is that David Baker was not a lawyer. David Baker was a farmer, like most landowners in Western North Carolina. He wasn't called Esquire because he had a law degree. He was called Esquire because he was a justice of the peace, a local judge, one of the guys who could read and write and who owned land, so he could serve on the county court. So we can figure out this sort of thing using any of the legal dictionaries that are readily available for free online. The one I happen to use here is Black's Law Dictionary. It's probably the gold standard for most genealogists. But in other cases, if we really want to understand those records, we have to look at the laws themselves. So if we consider, for example, those orphan children cases, whether it's the case of Mary and John Amburn in 1807, or whether it's the children bound to Daniel Russell in Robeson County in August 1866, we're going to have to actually look at the statute books themselves. We need to know, in the case of the Amburn children, that the laws allowed the county courts to take away from the mothers any child where the estate of the orphan, and that included any child whose father had died, where that child's inheritance was, and I quote, of so small value that no person will educate and maintain him or her for the profits thereof. In other words, any poor child whose father had died was subject to being taken away from the mother, sent off to strangers to labor for them and to learn a trade. And there was very little that a mother could do in these cases. If she didn't have family or money to back her up, the law said she wasn't even entitled to her own children. And it gets worse. If we look at the case of the children born to Daniel Russell, you remember I mentioned that they were orphaned freedmen, free children of color. And as far back as 1762, the law in North Carolina said the court could bind out all free base-born children. Now think about that for a minute. If your child was born during the period of enslavement, you had no legal marriage recognized as an enslaved person. That makes your child a base-born child. And even this was changed long before the Russell case to include a provision that any child of, and I'm quoting from the statute, free Negroes and mulattoes could be bound out when the parents with whom the children live don't habitually employ his or her time in some honest, industrious occupation. That's a lot of waffle room to take kids away from their parents and put them to labor for somebody else. And this was changed again in 1866, just before Daniel Russell went to court to provide that in the binding out of apprentices of color, the former master was given preference to anybody else. So now, looking at these laws, we've got a different picture of what was going on with those kids in 1866, don't we? Now, it's entirely possible in the Amburn case, because of the very small amount of the bond she had to post, small estate, very small amount of money she was able to raise in the inventory sale, no land, no dower rights. Her kids literally may have needed support. But in 1866, you know what's happening. Newly freed children of color all over North Carolina were being scooped up by former enslavers on the grounds that their parents hadn't been married when they were born, so they were free, base-born children. Or if they couldn't get away with that, they made the arguments that the parents weren't training them upright. They didn't follow some honest, industrious occupation. So if we really want to understand these records, we're back to where we started. We're going to have to spend the time understanding the law at the time that record was created and in the place where that record was created. Now, I get it. This isn't always easy. Some states, and North Carolina is one, that makes it easier than others. But there's something we can all do. There's something I do. Yes, I've got a law degree. Yes, I've done this for years, and I still do this consistently. If I want to get the legal context of a record that I'm not sure I understand, you ready? You're going to do what I do? You're going to cheat. Look, for heaven's sake, we don't want to make this hard on ourselves. We want to use every single tool that we have at our disposal to find the laws that are going to explain the records. And that's usually the hard part.
Hey, Judy, sorry. We have someone's asking for immediate help to go over the law part again. So maybe if you could just briefly recap.
If we're talking about the law that was dealing with those kids, what we had was a structure that took a child away from the parent. And that was established by statute. So the legislature basically made the decision that it didn't want children not being raised to be contributing members of the society. And as you heard Renata say earlier, the rights of women were so limited under the law. These are the concepts that we learn when we cheat and find out what the statutes and what the laws are. So how do we get there? How do we find out what those statutes are that explain these records? That's always the hard part. Finding the records, usually not so difficult, particularly if they're in the North Carolina State Archives. I know you had a great presentation on the records that the archives holds.
Yes.
But how do we find the laws? So I always start, if I'm going into a jurisdiction that I'm not familiar with not a general search engine, but a specific search engine, we can call it, a website that a lot of us kind of forget about when I've been doing this for a whole week. I don't need that anymore. Start with Cindy's List, for Pete's sake. Go to the page for each and every state. This is the page for North Carolina. Every single state page on Cindy's List has this link for the laws and statutes of that jurisdiction. So you click through on that link, And I like these results, particularly for North Carolina, for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a great quote up at the top. Gee, I wonder who said that. That's a quote from me on how important it is to know the laws of the time and place. But the second thing that's on this page is something terrific that you get as a North Carolina researcher. And that's the link to the session laws of North Carolina starting in 1777. There's a whole set of links that's been put together by the State Library of North Carolina so that you can review and research every one of the laws that was passed by the legislature called the General Assembly starting with statehood in 1777. Now, let's take a second to make sure we understand what we're talking about here. Session laws are the laws that are passed every time the legislature meets. So a meeting of the legislature is called a session. So there will be the April 1777 session. And so the session laws are purely chronological laws passed during that session of the legislature. Some of them are what are called public laws, meaning they're supposed to affect everybody equally. And some of them are called private laws because they were passed for the benefit of a single individual or a group of individuals, even a family. You're going to find both in the session laws. You're going to use both in your genealogy. We're going to use an example from the private laws just because I want to emphasize how valuable they can be. So let's say that we click on the link for the private session laws passed by the General Assembly in 1854-55. It's got like 400 pages. I don't want to read through 400 pages. I want to search. I want to search for a keyword like bond or marriage or something like that, or because we're searching private laws, use a surname. So let's use Baker for this example, because that happens to be one of my family surnames. So you put in the keyword, you click on the search icon, and the site is going to tell you that there are 8 hits in this book. And it loads a page into the viewer, usually the page with the first hit. Now, if we were to look at the entire screen that comes up at this point, you can see that it tells you there's a Baker on this page 15, and somewhere in this book, there are 7 other hits. But I want to see Baker on this page, and I only want to see those hits. Well, this site lets you do that. So looking again at what you're usually going to get if you just got it up on part of your screen, pay attention to that little icon. And it's only going to come up if you hover over the screen. So you put your mouse over the page and it says expand. So you just click on the image and it's going to come up in a separate view. And what do you get in the separate view? Yep, the name Baker highlighted on the page. So I'm not even going to have to read through every word on this page, hoping not to overlook where Baker appears. And to narrow down the list of hits, if you're on that first page and you want to see just the pages with the hits, you go to the filtered button, click on that, and it will only list the pages where the name Baker occurs. So you're able to go through them a lot more quickly. And that, by the way, is how I happen to find this private law in that book. It's a resolution granting relief to one D.D. Baker. Now, he stood surety. He was the bondsman for the former sheriff of Yancey County, who happened to be his brother, Charles Baker. And of course, the fact that these both happen to be the younger brothers of my third great grandfather, that's just a detail, right? Great stuff in the private laws. And
Yes.
everything I'm telling you is something you're going to find in every jurisdiction. But I want you to remember something about this page. As good as it is, it starts in 1777. And many of us have got ancestors who were in North Carolina earlier than that. So where do we go to find the session laws before 1777? And again, I love researching in North Carolina because there's one-stop shopping even for that. The place I go to, the place I recommend is this one, Documenting the American South from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Once you get to that collection, you're going to go to the Colonial and State Records collection. Cursor down to the section for laws. And you'll see that it's got the laws from, frankly, as early as anybody's ever been able to find them for North Carolina. And they were assembled and published by the state in 3 volumes, volume 23, 24, and 25 of the Colonial and State Records. Now, if you click on volume 23, it begins with a preface, and that was written by Walter Clark. He was the second editor of this series and a justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And he said that this collection begins in 1715. And that's what he did. But there are earlier laws in a later volume. I think it's volume 25. So everything that anybody's ever been able to find, one-stop shopping. Now, this may sound a little complicated, and we're not done yet. Because you may get the answer to a genealogical question in the chartering documents, the original royal charter of 1663, or the chartering documents that you and I would call the constitutions of North Carolina.
Oh.
Starting with things like the Constitution of 1776, the Constitution of 1835, where they took away the vote of free men of color who were property owners, the Convention of 1861-62, where they withdrew from the Union, the 1868 Constitution for Reconstruction, and then when they rolled it back in the amendments of 1876, the suffrage amendment of 1900, which took effect in 1901, which put in literacy tests and poll taxes and, well, essentially removing African-American voters in North Carolina. In 1946, I was frankly surprised to see the equality amendments where they changed language. Like instead of saying all men are created equal, they changed it to all persons are created equal. And instead of every man has the right to trial by jury, every person has a right to trial by jury. 1946 in North Carolina, yeah. Equal rights language in that amendment. And then today, of course, we're under the Constitution of 1981. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about and looking at and using as examples are laws and records that impact people of color. And I chose those deliberately because they're such a huge part of the legal history of America, not just North Carolina, not even just the South, but every slaveholding jurisdiction. And that included the northern states well into the early years of the 1800s. And we're always going to be finding records that maybe we're not entirely sure we understand. Records like this entry in the court minutes in Yancey County in 1834, when Richard Johnson, I think it says Johnson, came into court as a free man of color and wanted his freedom recorded by the clerk of the court. So what does this mean in the context of time and place? Where are we going to find those laws? If we're specifically looking at this area, the laws of slavery and free people of color, there are some additional resources that may make it a little bit easier than going session law by session law by session law. And one place to start is a free database from a paid subscription site. So I give Hein Online a lot of credit for opening this up. Now you do have to register, so make sure you get a free account. And you're going to go to this Slavery in America and the World database. Once you work through a few screens, it's going to give you a list of states. You're going to cursor down till you get to the one that you're interested in, like North Carolina. Open that link up and it gives you the list of all of the laws North Carolina passed impacting the issues of slavery or free people of color from 1804 to 1865. Now you notice these are not the first laws. These are essentially the laws of statehood. There were earlier laws passed in colonial times that simply survived into the early statehood days. But you can choose a legislature. So we're going to pick a few from the 1820s and click on any one of those, and it opens up a submenu for each year. So I opened up 1820, 21, 22, 23, and you can see that each of those now has a list of the laws that was passed in those years. So if we click on one, we're going to choose this one, an act to emancipate Sally Zimmerman. Click on that link and you get an actual copy of the statute itself.
That's amazing.
It's a terrific resource. And again, it's free, totally free. And they've committed to leaving it free forever. Now, what gave rise to the laws? Petitions to the legislature. And you can find those over at the Digital Library on American Slavery in the Race and Slavery Petitions Project. So this has got both legislative and court records. It's limited to the southern states. But you want to see the legislative petitions? You do a search on this site. I did one by changing the jurisdiction to North Carolina. I made sure to change the end year so that I would go all the way to the end in 1867. And I added just one keyword, legislature, just to get the legislative records. And there are 59 hits just in this petitions project. And they're interesting stories, every one of these. The first one, a complaint to the legislature by an enslaver against a justice of the peace. Because this enslaver had people escape. He'd gone and grabbed them back. And the JP said, you can't do it that way. So he wanted this guy run out of town on a rail. In the second case on this page, it's a woman who says she's old and advanced in years. Her enslaved person had been condemned to die for crime. And she was entitled to compensation from the state of North Carolina. In the last one, in 1790, a petitioner said that he had bought enslaved persons from a Tory who was fleeing to go to Barbados, but the state had grabbed them up and confiscated them anyway as the property of a Tory. So he wanted them back. And if you click on any one of these, like that one in the middle where the old lady says she wants the money, you will get an explanation of the case, the date, the number of pages, and the most important thing of all, it tells you who's got it. In this case, it's in the North Carolina State Archives. So there are these additional resources. But on almost any issue, whether it's slavery and free people of color, whether it's marriage, whether it's dower rights, any particular issue, you want to go to the laws themselves. And I get the fact that it's not always easy. So there are some tricks that may make it a little bit easier. Instead of just looking at the session laws, see if you can find compiled laws like this set from North Carolina in 1837. So remember what I said about the session laws. They're chronological, session by session. So if there's a marriage law in 1777 and a marriage law in 1790 and a marriage law in 1824, that means you got to go to 3 books. But what these compiled laws do is pull all of the session laws together by topic. So here in 1837, all of the laws about enslavement and free people of color brought together. They're usually alphabetical. So you would get apprentices, and then banks, and then bonds. And here we have under the S's, slaves and free people of color. So all of the laws still in effect in 1837 are all in one place. And I want you to pay particular attention, because this is true in many of these compiled laws in many jurisdictions. That little note right there, I know you can't see it. Let me blow it up for you. That's your citations. That tells you where those bits and pieces of that code came from. They're all from the laws of 1816, chapter 910, sections 1, 2, 3, 4. You can go now directly to that 1816 law and see it in context. And you're going to see this in the later codes. In 1855, same thing. One topic, slaves and free Negroes, and those marginal notes. And this isn't as good, but at least it takes you back to the 1837 statutes, and you can use that to get even further back. And you got to read these statutes to get a feel for what life was like. The sections on emancipation, for example, seeing how hard it was, how hard they made it for an enslaver to free an enslaved, putting an impossible burden on the freedman to leave the state within 90 days or face being seized and sold back into bondage. Now that's going to change over time. In 1741, you had 6 months to leave, but by 1830, they changed it down to 90 days. So look for the compilations, even look for unofficial compilations. I love, in North Carolina, John Haywood's Manual of the Laws of North Carolina. Again, organized by topic, but what he did in the manual was go year by year. So you can see the first law that he found was passed in 1729. So it's alphabetical, but chronological to give you that history and that sense. So every record set, we want to go through this process. Doesn't matter what the issue is, doesn't matter what the record is. Every single time, and you already know what I'm going to say, right? We want to understand those records. We need to understand the law, when that record was created and where it was created. Now, this can sometimes lead to complications. If we look at a record set that so many of us use, because it's so amazing, the 1867 voter registration lists, they're now held in the state records at the North Carolina State Archives. I mean, you look at the catalog, there's a lot of really neat stuff. Now, they're not digitized, so they can be hard to access, at least now, in the time of COVID. But here's a better question. Why do these records exist at all? In other words, whose law served as the impetus for these records? So much of what we've already talked about is the North Carolina laws. But we have to remember that there were United States laws that affect us as well. This is a federal system with one federal government and one federal constitution and one federal set of laws, which actually makes it easy because there is really, really one-stop shopping for all federal laws from the first statutes ever adopted after the Constitution right up until 1875. And it's this site, Century of Lawmaking for a New Nation, free from the Library of Congress, and the statutes at large are the federal session laws. And that's where you'll find the 1867 law passed over the veto of the president at the time, requiring a registration to be made of male citizens of the United States, 21 years and upwards, in every county, including only those qualified to vote and only from the states that had been in rebellion. That's the registration that was recorded in 1867 under federal law. Now, there's a way to do some research in this, even though the archives are closed. There is a published version of this by Frances Holloway Wynne that's available on Heritage Books. But remember, this is a one-time deal, this federal registration. The feds don't usually control voting, except in federal elections. Voting is a matter of state law. So it's going to be set out usually in things like the Constitution. And remember, there was a new one in 1868. It provided terrific. Every male born or naturalized, 21 or older, living in North Carolina for 12 months, in the county for 30 days, you can vote. But you're not going to find them in that 1867 list. You're going to find them in books that look like this. The Registry of Voters of North Carolina. These are digitized, a lot of them at Family Search. This one from Beaufort County. And there's a label. Let's read it. It says it's under the North Carolina Act of 1868. And that's not very explanatory. So we would go to the books and take a look. And it tossed out the federal registration. It insisted on a state registration separate and apart from the feds. And you know why? They didn't want the voters that the feds were registering, particularly the newly freed African American voters. And this was made much more complicated with the suffrage amendment, again, passed in 1900, took effect in 1901, because that not only had the effect of removing most African American voters, because it had a literacy test and a poll tax. And of course, if you've got a literacy test, you've got people administering it. And the way that they did that impacted who they allowed to vote. But this had a clause that saved the rights of illiterate whites to vote. Their grandfathers had to be on the voter rolls by the 1st of January, 1867. And you know why they picked the 1st of January, 1867, because it was before that federal voting list, which would have included African Americans. So that's the law that explains it when you see records like this one, allowing James Moody to vote. Not because he met the requirements, but because he was the descendant of a man registered to vote on or before January 1st, 1867. In every case, there's always something more. There's something beyond the face of the record. There's something that's going to tell us the rest of the story. And I know you want to know the story of the kids who were scooped up by Daniel Russell in 1866. Now, 2 of them were girls by the name of Harriet and Eliza Ambrose. They were the children of a newly freed woman named Hepsy Saunders. She had married, they had a stepfather. Hepsy did not take it sitting down or standing still for 1 minute when Daniel Russell's son and his henchmen rode onto the farm where she was working and took her children. She went to court. Now, she went first to the Superior Court, which said, essentially, it was very sympathetic to her, but it said, we don't have the power to overturn the binding out of these children. So what did she do? She went to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And it was there that the Chief Justice, a man by the name of Reed, wrote, and I quote, "The petitioners are females, respectively 13 and 15 years of age, industrious, well-behaved, and amply provided for. They live with their mother and stepfather, who are of good character. What better off could they be, or need they to be? And in sending these children home to their mother and stepfather, safe forever, he asked this question: what interest had society in having their relations broken up and themselves put under the care of strangers with no affection for them, nor any other interest except gain from their services? In every case, in every jurisdiction, follow it through all the way. Because, and you can repeat with me at this point, if we're going to understand the records, we've got to understand the law.
Amen.
At the exact moment that record was created, and in the place where that record was created. And I hope we've got a little bit of time for some questions.
Wow,
Yeah.
we do. But right now, whew, I got so much from that, Judy, myself. And, I call myself knowing North Carolina, but you've given me a year or two's worth of work to do now.
I'm delighted. The laws themselves they tell such a story. They just make such a difference in what we understand and know, and the way that we pull everything together, and it's
it's truly what gives it context, right? That's how we really,
it gives us the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Yes. And, you spent quite a bit of time talking about apprentice law, and that has deeply impacted my research. That's the one part of what you talked about that I was already very, very familiar with. And, it struck me when you focused on the fact that the mother had no say-so in what was happening with her children, because I've had it on a few lines, but specifically my Hills in Terrell County, North Carolina, the same family that I mentioned that the father was brought to court for trading with a Negro, all of their children were apprenticed, and all of their children's children were apprenticed. And you just see it over and over and over again. And I've often thought, well, what did that mean for that mother? Sometimes I have learned that the child was not actually removed from the family. So the child was still living in the home with the parental units. But that doesn't seem to be mostly the case.
That's not the norm, because remember that what the person to whom the child is bound is getting out of this deal is the labor of the child.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely.
And that was a big deal in some jurisdictions. Now, it didn't happen that much in North Carolina, but in some jurisdictions, you'd actually get into a bidding war between two or three people who all wanted the kid because of the labor that they could get. You get a 13-year-old strapping boy, and you're going to get to keep them for 8 years.
Yeah.
That's a real economic benefit.
Yeah.
And one of the things that some of the researchers in my Hill Bryant group have talked about is that we see sometimes the child not being assigned an occupation or a skill or trade to learn. And we suspect sometimes that there could be a situation of parentage where it's actually the father apprenticing his own child. What do you think of that, Judy?
I know of cases, I've certainly seen one in my own family where the person to whom the child was bound was a grandfather, because it was actually easier to get a child bound to a family member than to have to post what you would otherwise get, which is a
Bastardy bond, yes.
and that's where you've got to tie up some of your assets,
right.
if you actually had assets. But most of the time you get things like girls being bound out to learn the art and mystery of being a housewife, or boys with the art and mystery of being a farmer.
Yes, yes.
That's
Well, Judy, before we go into the question and answer, I just want to read some of these comments from Daphne Gab. Just love the information from Judy. Awesome. Thanks so much from Dana Lee, Tierra Cotton Kello. Thank you, Judy. Preach, Judy. That's from Janice Gilliard. So glad the recording will be available. Judy always delivers 110%. Janice is also thanking you and me, Tania. Thank you, Janice. It's our pleasure. Just a few more wonderful presentation. Excellent. And the next step in analyzing our research in the next level. Thank you so much. Tania, jump in whenever you want to.
Shirley says, what a wonderful presentation. She's going to replay it. I think a lot of people have found so much value and want to come back and study what you've been saying. So
yes, and I will be replaying it, because Tania and I are doing some other stuff behind the scenes. So I know I have to go back and replay it. Lynn Cardwell is just overwhelmed. Charlene learned so much.
Ron acknowledges your website, Judy, is being a very valuable resource too.
Terrific. Good.
My very astute cousin, Kristen Williams, who's one of my Somerset connections, says, I now have tons of helpful resources to use for my research. Thank you for this presentation. So we can't read them all, but Judy, we do save the chat. So hopefully you'll go back later and just read all the accolades and thank yous. So
thank you all for your kind words.
So before we go into the Q&A, this is usually the place where we show you what our next episode is going to be, but we aren't having a next episode that we know of. So I can guarantee you, well, I guess I shouldn't say that because I never say never, but I do believe that this is at least the last thing we'll be doing in 2020. If we happen to come back with a winter episode, you all will be the first to know. So please make sure that you subscribe and ring the bell if you see it, because some of us don't see the bell. So subscribe and ring the bell. And also please follow us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. Tania, maybe you can grab the link.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put it in there. Let me just go take a moment to do that.
Thank you. And one of the things we want to ask is that you not only like the page, but that you also follow the page. And that way you will be sure to get any posts and any announcements that are placed on the page. And now for Judy, from Margot Williams, Judy, she says, could it be argued that a child going to school was not working, therefore could be apprenticed?
That would be a hard sell with a court, because that is an honest and industrious occupation. The problem was that, we think of school as a 9 or 10 month deal. Even the freedmen's schools, in the months after the Freedmen's Bureau began to establish those schools, if they got 30 days, that was a lot of time. So the argument isn't going to be made while the child is in school. The argument is going to be made during the 10 or 11 months when they're out of school. And that's where the issue is going to come up.
Okay. All right. We have another question from Antonio, and he says, speaking of justice of the peace, are there documents that can be found relating these people? I have an ancestor / former master who was a justice of the peace in Chatham County.
You betcha. You want to, again, we got to wait until COVID, but the North Carolina State Archives has got the, generally speaking, the commissions to the justices of the peace. They were nominated by the court officials, but selected by the governor. So there's a gubernatorial commission for the JPs. And then in the court minutes, the first time that justice sat with the county court, he should be recorded as presenting his commission and being allowed to take his seat. So you want to find both the commission records themselves, which are at the North Carolina State Archives, and then the court minutes for the day that that justice first began to sit with the county court.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Janice Gilliard would like to know what you think of Google Scholar, Judy.
It's terrific. It's got a lot of material that you're just not going to find anywhere else. One of the things that Google Scholar has is court cases. Now, these are only the published opinions, and they're not complete, but it's one free place to go. Now, there's another that's from Harvard Law School, where they got together with what is now a commercial group called Ravel Law to digitize every single book of published court cases, which, by the way, includes that Ambrose case there in North Carolina. And that, I believe, is simply case.law. And that's the Harvard entrance to this database. And it's thousands and thousands of reported North Carolina cases. So that's another possibility when you're looking at court records as opposed to the laws. Because the court cases, of course, explain how the laws get applied to specific facts.
Okay. Okay, Tania, did I miss anything?
So there's another question that just came through from Lou Dawson. Lou is asking, how much power did the Justice of the Peace have?
They had huge amounts of power at a very local level. The courts in North Carolina, as I said, I live in New Jersey, and our government functions are handled by the boards of chosen freeholders, and only the court functions are handled by the courts. That's not the way it worked in North Carolina up until 1868. The county courts, those courts of common pleas and quarter sessions, ran the show in North Carolina. They set the tax rates. They determined who got to do the grist mills, how much you got paid for building a courthouse or building the roads. They chose the road overseers. They named the patrollers to keep the enslaved people in line.
The patty rollers.
Absolutely had enormous authority at the county level. So they were critically important, and they were not trained at the law. These were your local property owners, which means in the Piedmont and the East, they were inevitably slave masters. In the West, of course, slavery just wasn't as pervasive. So you do get justices of the peace in Western counties who were not enslavers. They were just landowners.
All right.
Well, Judy, we just appreciate you so much. I feel like 1,000 thank yous would not be enough.
Yeah,
You're
truly.
most welcome. Anytime I get the excuse to talk about the law and North Carolina, no problem.
Well, that's a wonderful lead in to something that I'm about to do that's a little bit of a step aside from our norm. We don't normally advertise other events on our show, but at the request of Kathleen Roos, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
She asked me to share, and because it is Judy and it's about Judy, and Judy is our speaker, I, as a member of the North Carolina Genealogical Society, would like to invite anyone who is a member and anyone who would like to become a member before November 7th to join us for the free Member Appreciation Day. Now, if you think you got something wonderful for free in this last hour, Judy is going to spend the entire day with the North Carolina Genealogical Society. And this, for the cost of membership, which if I'm off the top of my head, I think it's $35 for a digital membership. You can hear Judy all day long. She'll be talking about property rights and wrongs, African Americans at the courthouse, no, Nanette, what negative evidence is and isn't, NARA Mythbusters, your family is in the archives, and no vitals, no problem, building a family through circumstantial evidence. So I invite you to join me along with all other members who wish to take advantage of this opportunity at the North Carolina Genealogical Society's free virtual member appreciation day. Just go to ncgenealogy.org and get yourself registered as a member. And if you're already a member, get yourself registered for this wonderful day with our speaker, Judy Russell. So Judy, there's a little plug for you and there's a plug for NCGS. You can thank Kathleen Roos for that. So,
I am a longtime proud member of the North
Carolina. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think that's it for our fall special. I just appreciate everyone who joined us today. I was a little nervous, Tania. I didn't know if people would come back out for us.
Oh, people came out, man.
Yes,
we had close to almost 100 people
almost
live.
100 live, yes. And
yes.
Really, but Judy, that's really more about you than it is about us.
Definitely.
If you guys hadn't taken the initiative to create the forum, anybody with North Carolina roots owes you a debt of gratitude for what you've done this summer.
It's been our pleasure. So we just ask everybody, please share the link to this presentation in your social media outlets on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest. I can't even think of what they all are.
All the platforms, TikTok.
Oh my gosh. Is Genealogy on TikTok too?
Yes, in fact, I saw a clip of a lady who's being interviewed by her grandson, and he's sharing her interview clip.
That's cute.
On TikTok. She was born in 1925.
Oh my God. Tania, we're going to have to come up with a little rap and put it on there.
We should. We should.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know that there are so many other places you could have been and you could have spent your time today. And I, as a matter of fact, am going right off to another presentation as soon as this ends. So everybody have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, a wonderful autumn. And we possibly will see you again in the winter with another presentation.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Judy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.